Good afternoon, and welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar, Agrivoltaics, How Can Solar Energy and Agriculture Work with Each Other? My name is Brian Hepner, Communications Associate for the Illinois Power Agency, and I'm filling in today for our usual Power Hour host, Megha Hamal. A few housekeeping items before we get started. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. We'll be taking questions from our audience toward the end, so please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and that can be done by sending questions directly via the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Today's session is being recorded, and a recorded version will be available on the IPA website under About Us/events. A couple of points I want to emphasize. This webinar is for general education purposes only and does not represent a legal interpretation or a statement of policy by the Illinois Power Agency or its staff. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed speakers for this session. Our first speaker is Joel Tatum. Joel is the Midwest Solar Specialist at American Farmland Trust, where he develops outreach programs and conducts research around the applicability of agrivoltaics in the Midwest. American Farmland Trust is a nonprofit organization that works to protect farmland, promote environmentally sound farming practices, and keep farmers on the land. Prior to joining AFT, Joel worked in the solar industry on projects focused in agriculture and small commercial settings. In today's presentation, Joel will provide an overview on agrivoltaics, its challenges, and market drivers. The next speaker will be Professor Kai-Yu Guan, who is the Blue Waters Associate Professor in Agroecosystem Sensing and Modeling at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Guan is also the founding director of Agroecosystem Sustainability Center, a new initiative utilizing satellite data, computational models, fieldwork, and machine learning to address how climate and human practices affect crop productivity and ecosystem functioning. As the Blue Waters Associate Professor, he leads multiple federal research projects from NASA, the National Science Foundation, and the United States Departments of Energy and Agriculture. Professor Guan is the recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award and the NASA New Investigator Award, among others. In today's presentation, Professor Guan will discuss challenges and opportunities for agrivoltaics in Illinois. Our final speaker will be IPA Deputy Legal Counsel Sarah Duffy. Sarah participates in the development and preparation of the agency's annual electricity procurement plan, as well as biennial revisions to the agency's long-term renewable resources procurement plan. And she also assists in researching and formulating guidance on legal issues and legislation impacting the agency and the industry in which it operates. Prior to joining the IPA, Sarah worked as the North American Government Affairs Manager for the Under 2 Coalition and for Georgetown Climate Center, where she drafted state comments on federal regulations and advised policymakers on electricity policy. As a Shapiro Fellow at UCLA, she worked for the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and Environmental Law. In today's presentation, Sarah will discuss considerations for agrivoltaics incentives for community solar projects in Illinois. Just an overview of the IPA Power Hour. It is a series of educational and informative webinars on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. We have the upcoming webinars that will be taking place in May and June. The slides will be posted on the IPA website events page under About Us, where you can click each link to register for these upcoming webinars. This slide is just to give you an overview on the agency and its responsibilities. The Illinois Power Agency, created in 2007, is responsible for the development and implementation of procurement plans for the electricity supply of utility customers, as well as solar incentive programs and the implementation of the Renewable Portfolio Standard. That concludes my portion of the presentation. Now I'd like you to join me in welcoming Joel Tatum to kick things off. Welcome, Joel. The floor is yours.
Hey, thanks to the IPA for having us today, and looking forward to this agrivoltaic discussion. Um, my name's Joel Tatum again. I'm the American Farmland Trust Midwest Solar Specialist and Midwestern native. Currently live in Missouri, but spent most of my uh, upbringing in central Illinois in McLean County. So I have a deep appreciation for farming and in the Midwest and soil health and things like that. Um, Today, I'm going to talk about just what AFT does and kind of our role in developing and promoting agrivoltaics and renewable energy while at the same time protecting our farmland. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So at AFT, we're steeped in land conservation and protection. We lose about 2,000 acres of farmland a day across the U.S. To some kind of development. Now that's inclusive of all kinds of development, not just renewable energy. But these developments as a whole have a serious impact on food production, environmental issues, and the next generation of farmers. Um, Climate change and extreme weather are compounding these risks uh, for development and soil health. So we believe solar will play a significant role in the number of acres that are developed over the coming years, but also see an opportunity with solar to have a dual use through agrivoltaics to keep that land in production and even improve soil health in some cases. The next thing that AFT does is to promote farming practices. We help farmers with these difficult transitions and moves towards more regenerative and new practices that can help us in our environmental and green efforts to help with soil health and sequester carbon and incorporate dual use and solar onto the land. Solar definitely falls into this category. Solar and agrivoltaics can be a really good way to diversify a farm, add income to that farm, and sometimes enable that farm to stay in practice and for that farming family to stay on that land by having the solar income and then further than that having the agrivoltaic crop income. And in closing on this slide, just trying to keep farmers on the land. We're seeing a large transition in farmland. More than 40% of American farmland is owned by farmers over the age of 65. And they look at this opportunity for solar and potentially agrivoltaics as, again, a great way to diversify the farm, to keep the family farm in practice, and to hopefully ensure soil health for years to come. So we try to provide guidance, tools, perform outreach, and enter into partnerships that help to connect the landowners in this diverse world of agriculture that we live in now, with precision farming to regenerative practices. It can be a lot. So we try to help farmers navigate through that. Okay, next slide. So what is agrivoltaics? Well, it's interesting officially, at the national level, there's still some work to be done, I think, on the official definition. But for now, and for in practice, agrivoltaics is a co-location of solar. It's a practice of installing a solar or photovoltaic panel on farmland in a way that primary ag activities, such as animal grazing, sheep, cattle in some instances, or crop and vegetable production can continue. Add to that, research in commodity crops. This is the goal of agrivoltaics, is to, when we have to, because of the need for interconnection or the need for, or because of where transmission lines fall, Many times in the Midwest, especially Illinois more specifically, a large portion of the land that is needed uh, geographically is what we would consider prime farmland. So having an option to incorporate an agrivoltaic at a community level, meaning a vegetable type crop, up to a commercial level, meaning could up to 1,000 acres or 1,000 head or more of sheep in a grazing system, or a true commodity crop that can be machine harvested, are real things that we're looking at and that are being studied and actually have been implemented in certain areas. So I'll get into kind of what that can mean for the farmer as we continue. But the design and management practices and the suitability for those ag practices, fare well in these agrivoltaic situations. And there's been a lot of work in Europe and Germany specifically on practices that work in certain soils, designs for these solar arrays that seem to work with certain crops. And now we try to bring those down to a regional level because every region is different, obviously, to see what specific crops in specific areas are going to be viable. In order for us to reach the ambitious renewable energy goals that we have, we need to incorporate agrivoltaics into the areas that we can to keep from sacrificing so many acres of this, what is much prime farmland in the Midwest. We are very lucky that as a rule, we don't live in an area where there are hundreds of thousands of acres readily available that we would consider marginal. We live in an area where it's largely farmed, so we need to try to incorporate some of these tools into practice. AFT and other groups in the Midwest and across the country are heading up research to see what designs and crops can be viable for income. Groups like the Department of Energy and developer groups are putting forth large funding amounts to move the needle forward on these efforts. And over the next couple of years, we will have some really good data, I think, that shows us what can be viable and help with a business plan for these farmer and developer groups. Okay, next slide. So when we think about what some applications of agrivoltaics can be with different kinds of solar, and so basically 3 different buckets or categories of solar. We've got distributed generation, which is typically farmer, landowner, or business owned solar. In these practices, they're typically smaller, but with the caveat that some farms and businesses need several megawatts on their land, which can get into multiple acres, obviously. So in these type of situations, are really good for research for agrivoltaics and small horticulture crops, farmers market type crops, community gardens, and then back to good research areas to help move things along. And these often are, what we found so far, are farmers that may be interested in doing some of this themselves for on-farm use. So the next bucket is the little bit larger developer or community-owned solar, and these are typically several megawatts in size or larger. And we see good models with horticulture crops, again, community gardens, farm to market type situations, vegetable and leafy crops that can be utilized and locally grown and sold. And that's good for developer, owner, landowner, and community. And that's really the goal, to keep everybody with a victory on these and keep that land in practice. And then the utility scale solar are large farms, obviously, and that's where probably we see the most need and the most urgent need for research and best practices, because these are the, hundreds up to thousands of acres that are being incorporated into solar and really taking up a substantial number of acres, and to go along with that, the largest opportunity for agrivoltaics, and actually a commodity crop, like a wheat type crop. We are looking at a crop called kernza, which is a perennial type wheat crop, can be machine harvested. The equipment does exist that can plant and harvest in the more or less standard conditions of a solar farm area. So those are some things that we're looking at when it comes to applications of agrivoltaics and different kinds of solar, and how the different kinds of solar can work with these different practices. Okay, next slide. So I want to talk about for a minute, maybe what are some concepts in agrivoltaics and solar and misconceptions. Off the top, just that crops won't grow under solar panels. Again, a lot of research being done and has been done through some European groups, and now the Department of Energy and other farmer and developer groups. Jack's Solar Garden out in Colorado is an excellent example of a really robust research facility. He's been doing this for several years, growing crops under different types of designs of solar, and been very successful. Again, regionally, those applications and those specific crops don't necessarily work the best in the Midwest, but it does prove out that it can be done, and will continue to grow in that way. Agrivoltaic practices add cost to project development. I think historically, when we used to think about being able to farm under solar panels, we would think about, the typical low edge of a solar panel is 2 to 3 feet at the lowest edge. You would have to be at 8 or 10 feet to even think about, farming under that. Not necessarily the case, is what we found out. And beyond that, the move towards tracking systems, single axis tracking systems, really lends to farming under the panels as well. The movement of those panels and creates more accessibility, less permanent shade, and creates more energy on the solar side as well. So those are things that have kind of changed the game as far as kind of dispelling that myth. Farming under solar panels can only happen in a manual harvesting situation. Now, sometimes that can be true depending on that design. But again, we're seeing on the whole that there are machine harvestable options in design that don't add significant cost to these developers, which means everybody wins, because the developer has potentially some lower cost in their operating and maintenance agreements, because you have that farmer coming in to do that work, and it could be a symbiotic relationship there. Depending on the way the projects are designed, agrivoltaics can cause erosion and soil damage. Most of the work and research that we're seeing and doing is a perennial crop option and or a no or minimum tillage option. So it goes in line with regenerative and sound farming practices. So we're just not seeing that to happen. It's quite the opposite, actually. Even if a cover crop is put in place, up front, to hold that soil and give that soil retention. Lastly, land with agrivoltaic array designs and practices don't add value to landowner or community. There are just so many things, additional revenue for the farmer. Now, we do see that many times, the current landowner may not be interested in being the agrivoltaic farmer, which creates an opportunity for a first farmer or an underserved community to step up and be a part of that and create some new jobs, some new income revenue, and some new opportunities. So in the cases where the landowner stakeholder is not interested in doing the practice themselves, we can add value back to the community in those ways. And also just on the local community side, if we keep the land in practice, we also continue to support the local co-op that sells the seed and the fertilizer and the local industry around farming that otherwise might be negatively affected. Okay, next slide. So at AFT, we think about what might be some best practices and what categories for these best management practices might be. So first we try to think about, okay, what crops, what can we establish agriculturally that might be compatible with these, and then try to develop some ready to go designs. Look at the developers that are using and utilizing agrivoltaics and trackers and lower cost elevated arrays. Determine the best construction installation methods to do that, to bring the two together. And then, further than just the crop into things, we're seeing a big opportunity with sheep grazing and potential for some varieties of cattle, depending on design. How can livestock play a role in how can the solar potentially improve animal welfare and health? I'm a cattle farmer. We have a cow-calf operation by trade, and when we do our intensive grazing systems, shade can become an issue certain times a year, especially in southern Missouri. So animal health can be incorporated into some of these things. Increase in site biodiversity, is not one answer. It's multiple crops, and we can see, for example, in a 2,500 acre agrivoltaic system, it's probably not all one thing. It's probably a percentage of conservation effort for pollinator. It's probably a percentage, or could be a percentage of a leafy crop, and then maybe a percentage of a commodity type crop. These are all things that we can work on. And lastly, that the pollinator portion of that can lend to wildlife habitat and help keep that wildlife where it's meant to be. Okay, next slide. So one way we get some of these practices in place is through some legislative policy, and I'll just talk about current legislative policy just briefly. There is an agrivoltaic incentive point in Illinois through the AVP and the process where the Illinois Shines accepts application. That was, believe it or not, developer led, and it's a great way for things to move forward as far as agrivoltaics. And USDA through the Farm Bill is accepting comments on agrivoltaic definitions, which tells us that there's more work and opportunity for farmers and landowners, most likely through agrivoltaic incentives that are not here yet, but could be very soon. Possible incentives that could be tied to the REAP grant for farmers and large-scale loans at low interest for larger developments. More development and deployment of small-scale solar through the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, over the next few years is a great thing to move forward. More smaller installations and potential for first farmer groups in underserved communities to create farming opportunities with agrivoltaics. Okay, next slide. So at AFT, we came up with these smart solar principles to share as far as an outreach and help us with some of this policy recommendation and incentive recommendation. You know, the first priority would be to emphasize solar development on rooftops, things like brownfields, areas that we consider non-farmland or very marginal farmland at best, where it doesn't lend to commercial farming. Principle two is that if the solar energy is developed on farmland, that we incorporate an agrivoltaic. Or I'm sorry, we incorporate policies and practices that protect soil health, especially during construction. And this is the example of adding a cover crop during construction, using tracked equipment during construction, using direct drive type situations instead of a lot of concrete, and then having a robust decommissioning plan that returns that soil and that farm back to land suitable for farming. Principle three is growing agrivoltaics, which is obviously kind of the hopefully the largest bucket for us, especially in the Midwest, where most of our soil that will be developed is considered good or prime farmland. You know, proving out that appropriate planning can be taken and agrivoltaics can thrive and create opportunity and revenue for existing landowners or newer first farmers, leading into principle four, to promote equity and farm viability and provide those opportunities to those underserved or first farmer communities and people where we can get them started into farming, create a revenue stream, create an opportunity for them to move forward and be a part of this. Next slide. So it's a four-pronged approach. You know, one, protect most productive land, increase clean energy, enhance farm viability, and promote regenerative practices. And that all comes back together through agrivoltaics and dual use. And us in the Midwest meeting our climate and our renewable energy goals. And that's where I'll wrap up. I appreciate everybody's time, and I'll kick it over to the rest of the group here.
Thanks very much, Joel. Our next presenter is Professor Guan. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, please move to the next slide. Hello, everybody. I'm very honored to come and give a talk. And then the content is related to about agrivoltaics. It's great to talk after the first speaker because we already set a great stage. So we assume that all the audience have been familiar with the agrivoltaics context and then concept. In our particular work, this is actually a new project that funded by USDA to our university, but it's also a consortium of a national effort because it's led by University of Illinois, but we also have multiple other institutes joining, including University of Arizona, Colorado State, because we are trying to develop solutions not only for the broader Midwest, but also potentially work for Colorado, Arizona type of the different environments. But this is a project we call the SCAPES, which refers to sustainably co-locating agriculture and photovoltaic electricity systems. And then in this particular talk, I will go into some details of introducing the project, introducing what we are working on, actually address some of the questions the previous speaker actually mentioned. Okay, so we will go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, SCAPES is a new project led by University of Illinois, but also include interdisciplinary teams that actually bring the agronomy, economists, biologists, engineer all together. And then this is really a project aimed to boost the renewable energy and the resilience of the food production. And as we are the leading institute, we have a very strong focus in the Midwest and very strong focus of the state, of our state. So next slide. Then the research goal actually has the multiple aspects. So we will actually conduct a real experiment environments. We will set up different setups of the agrivoltaic setup. This is primarily working with crops. So we are not looking at livestock. We're primarily looking at the crop, but this crop can be the Midwest row crop, or our Arizona, Colorado partners actually looking at vegetables and other type of the grazing lands beneath, and so they are actually doing some more variety, different varieties of the landscape. But we are at Illinois primarily focused on the conserving rotation system. And the assessments, we actually will look into details like different setups of the solar panels, how they coexist with the existing agriculture system. And we will go into more details about that. But what's important is we are actually want to go into the details and go to the science to understand, let's say if you set up solar panels in certain ways, you're going to actually affect the local light conditions, which also change the environment, local environment for crop growth, and what's the discount for crop growth, for crop yield. But at the same time, you gain the benefit of having the solar panel electricity, and then you basically try to optimize, how could you maximize the overall impact in dollar value, and then how feasible, what's the upfront cost, what's the potential continual incoming stream if you have certain setups. So these are all the questions that we hope to address through this project. And then, as I mentioned, there's a different components that try to come together. It's a very integrated project that try to bring structure, electron, thermal, agricultural, water management, as well as the economics all put together. So interdisciplinary team is a needed effort. Ultimately, we do have the hope to really generate solutions, and then so we are actually actively work with stakeholders to understand, how we can actually make, possibly to make this agrivoltaic technology as the new technology that can be perceived as a good solution, how we help them better understand. And we actually not try to, reinforce anything. We want to use the science to tell us the answer. And whatever the science we generated, we do hope to openly communicate it with our stakeholders, with our landowners, farmers. Okay, so next slide. So this again shows a little bit more context here, and there's different components that we particularly look at. Multiple institutes. Professor Madhu Khanna, who's not here, so I'm one of the core PI of the project. Madhu is the overall PI of the bigger project, and then we do have very specific aspect. We want to understand the crop grow beneath the solar panel, and how they, their productivity, their yield on the different setups of the solar panel. But also we have mechanical engineer scientists and his group, particularly looking at how to maximize the solar panel design to maximize the generation of the electricity, and then we combine all of them together through modelings. And there is a extension and education effort with the group. So next slide. And then, so these are actually coming from the Department of Energy National Lab and Rail. But it lays out multiple potential designs for agrivoltaic. So I think these are just multiple ways to do things. What we gonna particularly look at, as I already mentioned, we not look at the having solar panel above and have livestock or animals below. We are particularly looking at the crops, either row crop or specialty crop, fruit, fruit, vegetables, and then so we are looking at this system. And in Illinois, we particularly look at corn, soybean, and then so we actually pretty much narrow down to particular field type of systems. But we actually have the setups to do extensive experiments, measure things, testing the real environment. As you may know, that University of Illinois, if you drive past by in Champaign, we have a very sizable solar farm 2.0, which is a very big field with a lot of the solar panels. And we actually have some sites set up in that farm. Part of the locations actually will be used for test multiple things. and multiple experiments. So next slide. And then, so just give you kind of at the national scale, what would be the potential. So, this map shows really the red color means, this is not cropland, and the green color means it's a cropland. So you will see that there's a lot of the cropland in the US, including pastureland. And then, so, long story short, there is potentially a big opportunity for solar panel. However, it's never an easy question, because if you put the solar panel into your existing, landscape of either grazing land or cropland, there are gonna be challenges like upfront, pretty high upfront cost, operational cost, and then essentially how you kind of arrange the solar panels with your existing agricultural landscape, because there are gonna be a lot of trade-offs. And this is also why we set up this project, is because we don't have a very clear answer for now today. If you ask me, I cannot give you very definitive answer, and then probably the answer I expect are going to vary from place to place. However, through this project, what we hope, at least for the Midwest, we are looking at in Illinois, we should hopefully give you a relatively concrete answer at the end of the project. This is a 5-year project. We are in just finished the first year. We are getting to the second year, and then we do have some confidence that we are moving towards the goal to the kind of expected outcome that by the end of the 5-year, we should be able to pretty well answer some of the key questions that we listed here for the state of Illinois farmers. Next slide. And then, so, for me, I'm, as I mentioned, I'm one of the key PI, principal investigator of the project. And what I'm charging is really try to use the real measurements that scientists measure in the real environment, but I try to integrate these real measurements, but I try to model them. I try to model them in a way like how we set up solar panels. What, should we put them all together? Should we put them in a kind of distributed way? Or should we concentrate at one location or spread out? And then how, if we will set up the solar panel in certain ways, how the below the solar panel, how these crops will be affected in terms of their local environment productivity, their nutrient needs, being able to achieve high yield. All these questions that we are particularly trying to address, and of course, considering water limit, water constraints, environmental other constraints. So we are essentially the modelers of the group. Next slide. And so this is my last slide. As I mentioned to you before, I think there's opportunities, but again, we are scientists. We want to use the research outcome, to answer this question in a very factual-based, unbiased way. So if you ask me like how I should do Agrivoltaics today, I don't have a concrete answer for you. But we actually have multiple science questions, multiple experiments that in 1 year or 2, we should start to generate much more results, and we should start to share. And then I do believe there's a potential opportunity, but also potential challenges and barriers. And then so, as a land-grant university in the States, we really hope to provide the unbiased, the science-based insights to the community to help you, make the best informed decisions. And that's why we are here. So I will end my presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Guan. Great to hear from you. Our next up is Sarah Duffy. Sarah, the floor is yours when you're ready.
Thanks, Brian. And thank you to both of our previous presenters. That was really good technical information that I think when talking about agrivoltaics in the context of our IPA programs will make it just easier to kind of imagine how this all is going to fit together. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the current incentives that the Illinois Power Agency offers for agrivoltaic systems within our Illinois Shines program. So just as a reminder, I think probably most people on this call are familiar with Illinois Shines, but It's a program to offer financial incentives for solar installations less than 5 megawatts in size. And those projects get incentives depending on the category that they're in. So the incentives will differ depending on the size of the project, the type of project. And these are the categories that have their own set REC prices. So we have small distributed generation, large distributed generation, traditional community solar, community-driven community solar, public schools, and equity eligible contract led projects. So not all of these are going to involve opportunities for agrivoltaics. So today I'm going to really be focusing on traditional community solar and community-driven community solar. There are specific elements of the project applications and the way that we allocate incentives in those two subcategories that provide preferences or prioritizations for projects featuring agrivoltaics. Next slide. So as a reminder, these two categories are both community solar based. So community solar projects are kind of off-site larger solar projects where residential or commercial entities can subscribe to the project and basically subscribe to a portion of the project that provides energy proportional to their use in their own home or business. So these two categories are, both allow pretty large projects up to 5 megawatts. They're usually sited in areas with ample land, not, dense urban areas. The community-driven community solar category is new. It was created under the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in 2021, and it's really designed to support community solar projects that involve more oversight and involvement from the people that are subscribers and the local community that hosts the project. And it's really looking to have a tighter connection between the site of the project and the community that actually subscribes to it. So these two categories have different levels of incentives. And for both of them, we require that 50% of the subscribers qualify as small subscribers. So you can't just have two massive companies subscribing to all of the energy and have that qualify as a community solar project. Next slide. So I'm going to start with community-driven community solar. So just a little more information about this. The legislation actually included specific guidance as to what the IPA should consider when selecting projects to receive incentives in this category. So not only was it about connection to the community, participation from local residents, but it also included some site-related criteria. So the legislation specifically says that community-driven community solar should not be greenfield projects. And we are interpreting greenfield to be previously undeveloped land or agricultural land that does not meet the definition of a brownfield site. So other criteria related to this include the density of the location and ability to serve local subscribers. Next slide, please. So actually, could you go back to the last slide? Sorry, just to clarify. So, so because it's not a greenfield project, if it's taking agricultural land out of production, then that would not qualify under community-driven community solar. But as we learned in the previous presenters, a lot of land has marginal land that's not in productive use. And so that kind of siting would not qualify as in greenfield. Next slide. I believe in traditional community solar, the main prioritization or preference that we provide for agrivoltaics comes through the project selection process. So we accept project applications or incentives in each program year. But a lot of times we'll receive applications from a large number of approved vendors on the very first day, to the extent that it exceeds the amount of capacity that we have available. And so the law says that we shall select projects on a first come, first served basis. But if projects are submitted at the same time and that first come, first served basis is not available, that we're to develop methods to prioritize projects. So when that happens, we end up having to do a process that we call project selection, where we score projects received on the first day that exceed the amount of capacity that we have available. And we used a lot of the factors outlined in the statute for community-driven community solar that I just went over in developing that scoring system. We also included some other policy-based objectives as reflected through the legislature's addition of other elements in CEJA, such as the equity eligible contractor category. Next slide. So if there is a project selection process in the traditional community solar category, that is an opportunity for the IPA to encourage projects that feature better or more efficient land use decision making in developing those projects. So we've got a category of points available when scoring projects that focus on the built environment characteristics of that project. So we will award points for projects sited on disturbed land or contaminated lands or on a brownfield. We also award a point for commitment to use agrivoltaics or design the system to be an agrivoltaic site. We award a point for commitment to install pollinator-friendly habitat, which is related to agrivoltaics, but less formal production and a bit more passive. And then we also have a kind of restriction about projects that are sited on conservation opportunity areas, which is a designation from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Next slide. So how do we define whether a project will get the point for being an agrivoltaic system or a pollinator-friendly design? We are using this definition of agrivoltaics, basically a dual use configuration where the solar generation and agricultural production are integrated and they're simultaneously producing on the same footprint. We accept both crops and livestock grazing as agricultural production, and at least 50% of the project footprint must include that agricultural production. We also require that the project have a plan for increasing agricultural productivity over the life of the 20-year contract, and that the crops that they're choosing are compatible with the with the soil and the area and the geography. Next slide. So, okay,
Thanks again, Sarah.
thanks.
We have our Q&A session coming up next, and we have a few questions coming in. A couple from an entry-level agri-solar job seeker named Joe Scharf. Joe asks for his first question: which solar EPC and community solar developers in Northeast Illinois design or install real agrivoltaics solar systems? If anyone is able to take that.
The Illinois Power Agency does not have a list of such companies. I think that would probably either come from the American Farmland Trust, or potentially there are a bunch of trade associations that specialize in solar development. So they might have specialized lists of companies that specialize in agrivoltaics. So I would contact them about that.
Okay, and just a reminder, we will put up contact info for our presenters at the conclusion if you wanted more clarification on that, Joe. We have a question from the IPA's Rachel Burketta, who asks, is the soil damage seen with agrivoltaics related to the physical installation of the solar panels or something else that impacts soil health?
Yeah, I think it's there are two categories there. I think the first is there can be soil health issues depending on the approach that's taken during construction. You know, like I've mentioned, you know, track machines and non-concrete designs with direct drive posts can make for a better installation as far as soil health goes up front. And then on the backside, with regard to agrivoltaics specifically, using farming practices that are in line with modern regenerative agriculture, like no-till and minimum till type situations can keep that soil health in place. So I think there's two ways to look at that.
Great, thank you, Joel. Second question from Joe Scharf is, do the incentives give more points to vegetable or crop growing agrivoltaics compared to simple pollinator friendly solar projects? I believe that would be for Sarah.
Yeah, if you go back one slide, I think, or two slides, sorry, one more. Yeah, you can see the number of points awarded for each of the criteria listed here. So it's 1 point for each of those, 1 point for agrivoltaics or 1 point for pollinator friendly habitat.
Thank you. Question from T.O. Polk. Is there a financial modeling study for cost comparison of the different types of PV configurations for agrivoltaics?
In our project for Scapes, yes, we have, I would say, pretty comprehensive economic analysis and budget financial modeling for different setups. And that includes the electricity generated from the solar panel with different setups, as well as the crop farming cost. And then, and because you also plan to grow crops beneath, and so you're gonna have the crop yield. You're gonna have some yield loss, but it will be all integrated together. There's also gonna be some operational costs, like, for example, different setups, and some of the setups may allow tractors going in, some of them may not. So that also leads to sort of the machinery operational cost and the labor cost. So we try to be comprehensive, or at least as comprehensive as possible. Yes, stay tuned for these research outcomes.
Thank you, Professor. Nathan Wozniak asks whether the IPA considers taking agrivoltaics into account when it comes to selecting projects through utility scale procurements.
I don't believe so. I know Anthony is on the line, but I don't believe we currently do that. There's really only the utility scale procurements are based on price. It's a competitive procurement based almost entirely on price. There are a couple of things that they might get a bid adjustment for, but I believe that's really only use of equity eligible contractors. So currently, no.
Okay. Next question comes from Laura Lewis. You touched on community solar categories, but is agrivoltaics applicable to the LG-DG category?
No, currently we don't have any prioritizations or preferences for agrivoltaics in large DG.
Okay. Professor Guan has also elaborated on T.O. Polk's question within the chat. If anyone would like to check that out. Bill Bodine asks Sarah, are there any community scale solar projects receiving incentives through Illinois Shines that are currently operating and utilizing agrivoltaics or soon will be operating?
We have not awarded any rec contracts in this year to community solar projects using agrivoltaics. So we are still working on the TCS category scores. There were some errors in calculating the scores. All of that will be announced shortly, the final scoring. But up until this point, we have not awarded an agrivoltaics project a contract, but we hope that changes in the future.
Thank you. Shane Beebe, I think hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, Shane, asks whether any agrivoltaic sites in central Illinois are available to visit and wonders who to contact in the event that somebody wanted to go visit a site.
I put a link there. This is a university, basically the solar farm 2.0. You can get a lot of information by just browsing their website. I don't have a direct point of contact there, but you should dig into the website. And I also, my general impression is when we do field work, somebody actually opened the door for us because this is actually an electricity facility. So I guess you do need to reach to some people to let you visit, go inside. But the website should be able to show you tons of stuff already.
Thank you, Professor. Question from Stephen Brin. Is dual use being pushed in other types of development on farmland? It's interesting that the AFT found that 20 million acres had been lost in the last 20 years. Very little caused by solar. What do you feel that solar development is being required to look into these solutions and not other types of development?
I think that there are other efforts within AFT that obviously we didn't get into today, but there are other efforts pertaining to other kinds of development and conservation in our Farmland Information Center, or the FIC as we call it, is a great resource for that. You can reach that through the American Farmland Trust website, and there is a wealth of information on other conservation efforts that surround other types of development.
Thank you, Joel. And you might be able to answer this last one from Isaiah Field, who asks, are there different companies designing machinery to harvest crops? I know that generally the harvest equipment is huge.
Yeah, good question. You know, what we found in our research, which is early, is that companies that utilize research equipment for harvesting are an out-of-the-box type of equipment that already exists, which is great from a planting and soil preparation standpoint. There are many, what I would call semi-urban or food plot type tools that already exist. So the good news is not a need for new fabrication or new manufacturing of equipment to incorporate agrivoltaics.
Got it. And with that, we will display the contact information for all of our speakers in case anybody has additional questions. On behalf of the Illinois Power Agency, I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. We hope it was educational. Also, I want to extend thanks to our three presenters for providing an excellent presentation today. You can find a recording of this and other webinars on the IPA website under About Us/events. Thanks, and we hope to see you for the next IPA Power Hour on May 26th. Have a great afternoon.